Now to water had that Ainu whom the elves call Ulmo turned his thought, and of all most deeply was he instructed by Ilúvatar in music. But of the airs and winds Manwe had pondered, who is the noblest of the Ainur. Of the fabric of earth had Aule thought, to whom Ilúvatar had given skill and knowledge scarce less than to Melkor. But the delight and pride of Aule is in the deed of making and in the thing made, and neither in possession nor in his own mastery. Wherefore he gives and hoards not, and is free from care, passing ever on to some new work. And Ilúvatar spoke to Ulmo and said, Seest thou not how here in this little realm in the deeps of time Melkor hath made war upon thy province? He hath bethought him of bitter cold immoderate, and yet hath not destroyed the beauty of thy fountains nor of thy clear pools. Behold the snow and the cunning work of frost. Melkor hath devised heats and fire without restraint, and hath not dried up thy desire nor utterly quelled the music of the sea. Behold rather the height and glory of the clouds and the ever-changing mists, and listen to the fall of rain upon the earth. And in these clouds thou art drawn nearer to Manwe thy friend, whom thou lovest. Then Ulmo answered, Truly, water is become now fairer than my heart imagined. Neither had my secret thought conceived the snowflake, nor in all my music was contained the falling of the rain. I will seek Manwe, that he and I may make melodies forever to thy delight. And Manwe and Ulmo have from the beginning been allied, and in all things have served most faithfully the purpose of Ilúvatar. Ein Lindale. Welcome to Professing Literature. It's Oklahoma City, and it's the summer of the year of grace 2024. Professing Literature is, of course, the podcast where we look closely at short passages of important works of literature in the hopes of catching writers in action. We aim to work across literary genres and modes, whether comedy or tragedy, drama, poetry, or fiction, looking at the dynamics of a passage in order to understand what the author is doing and what is at stake for the work as a whole, the issues that it clarifies, the techniques that are involved. My name is David Anderson. I'm an associate professor of Renaissance literature at the University of Oklahoma in the Department of Classics and Letters. And of course, I'm joined by my producer, Mr. Eric Williams. Good evening, Eric.
Good evening, David. I am super excited.
Well, good. This one's been a long time coming. It's a special subject for both me and Eric tonight because we're talking, of course, about J.R.R. Tolkien, who is a writer who's dear to both of us. I'm going to say, I want to ask Eric a little bit about his Tolkien experience, but I'll say off the top that being a literature professor, I was in English departments for most of my career, and then I moved a couple of years ago to an academic department that's sort of broader based in its study of literature. But in English departments, Tolkien, one of the most popular and beloved authors of the 20th century, is not honored very much. Many readers love Tolkien. A few literary scholars appreciate him deeply. There are, of course, Tolkien specialists. There are, we can be sure, many other professional eggheads who enjoy Tolkien in secret, but he's never been respectable among the professional literary guild. Within the academy, I've heard any number of times people snicker at the idea of Tolkien. I just taught a course on Tolkien. Usually I do I just do earlier literature most of the time, which is great, and I love it, but I had the chance to do a whole class on Tolkien last semester in the spring of 24. And I loved it. It's one of my favorite classes I've taught in a long time. And I am only emboldened by the fact that some colleagues, not so much at OU, but around these United States, would roll their eyes at the idea of anyone studying this orc master. When Lord of the Rings was published, it met with many glowing reviews, but it met with some negative reviews also. The most famous was from one of the great figures of the literary critical world in the U.S., Edmund Wilson. And Wilson, in a 1956 review, called The Lord of the Rings juvenile trash. He talked about how he'd been reading it to his 7-year-old daughter and how she strangely seemed to appreciate it. But he saw through it and saw that it was a whole bunch of nothing. And for what it's worth, I'm actually reading The Lord of the Rings right now to my 7-year-old for the first time. And Mr. Wilson's daughter and my 7-year-old and me and Eric, we don't see things his way. Wilson says he just, aside from misspelling the name Gandalf, which only crops up about 750 times in the novel, he says the hero, meaning Frodo, has no serious temptations, is lured by no insidious enchantments, perplexed by few problems. Does that ring true to you, Eric?
Absolutely not.
He says, we never feel Sauron's power, which, it's amazing that he actually read the book. So to hell with that thinking. We don't all have to like the same things, and Lord of the Rings and the kind of literature that Lord of the Rings is does not have to, it's not for everyone, that's fine. But Tolkien's writing is one of the most remarkable creative achievements of the 20th century in the English-speaking world. I'm going to lay that down. That's not just either, as I hope to show in what follows, that's not just because of the sort of sheer inventiveness that he's famous for, the fertility of this imagination and what today is sometimes called world building. Tolkien is a great author because of the depth and beauty and wisdom in his books, as well as a unique but virtuosic prose style. But I do want to ask Eric, what's the sort of thumbnail story of your own history with Tolkien and these books?
Well, as you and I have talked about before, I came to Lord of the Rings through the Peter Jackson trilogy.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
As many people did.
Yep.
I was somewhat aware of the books prior to the movies, but I just, for some reason, I never got around to reading them. It just didn't seem like, but after I saw the movies, I was like, wow, this is pretty great. So, and it was after the third movie.
Okay.
And I finally decided, okay, I've got to go back and read this because I had conversations with people that had read the books, and they were like, well, the movies aren't exactly in line with the books on many areas.
Yeah.
So I was like, okay, I want to check this out. So I loved the books. I just was absolutely enthralled, and the amount of world building and just the detail and just the storytelling was great. So I think I fall into that category where I can still appreciate the movies since I saw them first, where I think you're kind of on the other end of that. You have a very different.
Yeah, I read the books maybe at sort of 13, 14, 15, and I loved them. And then I was one of many who struggled with the Silmarillion in the first time, and I didn't get it. And then I reread The Lord of the Rings a year later probably, and then went back to the Silmarillion and really understood it and loved it. And then it's been one of those things I've read every few years ever since. So now with my little boy, I don't know what reading this makes of them, but it's maybe around 10 or 11 times through. And they don't get old for me. And I've got some fondness for the movies. Like teaching this class, we'd sometimes talk a little bit about the movies. I didn't want the movies to be all of it especially present in the conversation, but we'd refer to them once in a while, so I'd be inspired to go and watch a 4-minute clip on YouTube, and there are some parts that are just fantastic that they do beautifully, and others that make me grimace, including when it comes, we might have been talking about this a couple of weeks ago, but my favorite character, Faramir, is served especially badly by the movies.
Yes.
But there are great moments, the Mines of Moria, the charge of the Riders of Rohan, the great celebration when Aragorn is finally crowned king. There are some pretty terrific moments in those movies. I've never sat down and watched the Hobbit movies. I've heard too much about
Again,
that.
Yeah, you would have to, in order to do that, you'd have to separate completely from the book that there are elements of it. And what I did find interesting in those, just a quick aside, is that they kind of bring in the story of kind of what is going on with Gandalf during that time period as it relates to dealing with the necromancer / Sauron.
Yeah.
So that's kind of interesting. But again, it's, if you're expecting the Hobbit book made into a movie, you don't really get that.
Yeah, it's such a tough one. I bet most fans of Tolkien would, if I issued this proclamation, I'd bet we'd get a lot of signatures. Not everyone's, but The Lord of the Rings could have been a 30-hour HBO series, and The Hobbit should have been a 2.5-hour movie.
Right.
Because the power of The Hobbit is that it is this simple, delightful children's story that doesn't need to carry the weight that The Lord of the Rings does. And so I just never wanted to see it kind of blown out that way.
Yeah.
We won't say anything at all about a certain Amazon Prime show. Eric and I have talked at some length in private about what we think about that.
Yeah. Maybe we can do a bonus episode.
Yeah.
If there's enough interest out there and you want to hear a bonus episode of David and I talking in depth about the Lord of the Rings movies and so-called shows purporting to be Lord of the Rings and Hobbit movies and all that kind of stuff, just let us know.
Yeah. My impression of YouTube is that there's only 80 or 90,000 other people doing their hot take reviews of Rings of Power and things like that. So
it's very lucrative.
Yeah, I bet.
Yeah.
I bet it is, actually. Okay, now that's different. Now we're doing but, Keats doesn't pay like that would pay.
Yeah.
We're going to do that, and then I'll have to sit down. I don't think it'll really suit me very well, but read through all the J.R.R. Martin stuff, and then we'll really we'll have a lot of content.
Yeah.
I don't think. No offense to those who love the Song of Ice and Fire. My impression from the HBO shows is that there's some really interesting, compelling stuff in that.
Oh yeah,
it's so dark.
Yeah.
And Tolkien can take us to dark places, but again, as I want to suggest in what follows this evening, we're not supposed to live there, and the other side is ultimately what he's interested in. But yeah, we've talked about doing a Tolkien episode for some time, and we've thrown so much poetry at our listeners lately that it just seemed like this would be the kind of, record scratching moment where we switch to a whole different kind of oral landscape. So,
I'm super excited.
Good. All right. Well, I will say off the top, I said this also to Eric when we sat down a little while ago. This is going to be a little bit of a different episode, probably, in that it'll be a little more reflective. It's not that I'm ever not reflective, but, the emphasis is on, or I try to put the emphasis is on interpretation. And I think, if you've been listening, that I don't pretend that I've got, whether it's Milton or Sydney or whatever, I don't pretend I've got a purely objective point of view. It's my interpretation. But this will be maybe a little bit, even more subjective. We'll see as I kind of work through a few different passages of Tolkien that are on the theme that interests me right now. So about that theme, I'm going to begin by asking you a question, whether you're in your car with the kids strapped in the back or making the rounds at Costco with your earbuds in, or as I expect most of our listeners, Eric, I think, stir up the fire in the fireplace and then sit in a big leather armchair and just listen to the podcast and don't do anything. I assume that's the normal way this is consumed. That's probably the
normal person that listens to this podcast.
Yeah, maybe with a nice glass of red wine or some scotch or something like that.
Yeah, and a leather bound book,
Yeah, they're just caressing.
Yes. They always seem to be reading that same book.
That's how we picture our listeners. But wherever you are in the world, I'm going to ask you a question. And the question is, what is most real about our lives in the world? What is most real? I don't know if it's the best framing for what I'm interested in. It's the way the question kind of came out of my head as I was putting my notes together. And I'll say at the beginning that there's 1,000 different ways of approaching a question like this and categorizing the possibilities. So if your first thought doesn't fit my category, that's okay. What is most real about the world? Couple of approaches. Number one, what is most real about the world is what T.S. Eliot, in a poem about the Elizabethan, or I should say Jacobean playwright John Webster, called The Skull Beneath the Skin. Behind the most beautiful human face you will ever see is a skull. When the skin and the muscle and all the tissues and everything are gone, that grinning skull will be left. From this perspective, the answer to my question would be that it is the moments of ugliness and misery that tell us the truth of the nature of things. Go into the most beautiful garden you can imagine and pull up a piece of masonry and see the squalid, miserable, grotesque scrambling of the bugs and worms underneath, and that's reality. Early in Moby Dick, Captain Ahab explains to Starbuck, his upstanding first mate, who's bothered when he discovers that the captain is leading them all not on a commercial whaling venture, but on a kind of frenzied quest for one whale in particular somewhere in the Pacific Ocean. Ahab explains to Starbuck why he hunts the white whale. Ahab, we know, has been badly wounded by that whale on a previous venture and lost his leg. So big deal. Well, Ahab says to Starbuck that all living creatures are what he calls pasteboard masks. Pasteboard masks. Behind all of those masks lurks what Ahab calls malice. So you see this thing that presents itself to you as a golden retriever or another human being, but behind all of them is the mockery of the cosmos, which reduces everything to death and blackness. And Ahab says that in chasing the whale and killing him, which is what he intends, he's going to have his revenge on that order that with cruel mockery laughs at all our strivings and all of our longings, that reminds us that we're just worm food, and that scorns every hope and every dream. He will punch through the mask and he will show his contempt, not just for the whale, but for the whale as the greatest of and most savage and most formidable of the creatures of the world. In killing the whale, he will strike his blow against the universe and get his revenge upon life. And so this is Ahab's magnificent contempt for the world, which reminds so many readers of Milton's Satan. Ahab says to Starbuck at the end of that exchange, Starbuck accuses him of blasphemy, and he says, "Talk not to me of blasphemy, man. I'd strike the sun if it insulted me." So that's one way of answering that question. What is most real about the world? But there's another emphasis. There's another, even if we just, from this one approach, there is, of course, another answer. And it would say, yes, the world is full of pain. Yes, death is present walking among us. Yes, the best can sometimes suffer worst. Yet picture, if you don't mind, early evening on a quiet street, with the sun slanting down, mingling touches of gold in the leaves of the trees. Picture a child laughing with the sort of free and unembarrassed laughter that only a child can really give themselves up to. Or picture a child concentrating over a book or a mud castle in their sandbox with the kind of absolute intensity that only a child can give to the object of their focus. Or picture a blue jay's pinion feather lying on a picnic table, perfect in all of that exquisite detail and complexity, with that beautiful blending of blues and grays and whites and blacks. Maybe it's those things that tell us the truth of ultimate reality. It's not that those things aren't fragile and passing in themselves. It's not like that blue jay's feather can be the everything for all time. But they open a window onto what is ultimate. And so from this perspective, the grubs and the bugs scrabbling under that rock you lifted up in the garden aren't the bottom of all reality. They're just bugs. They don't do any harm to the beauty of the garden. And it's the beauty of the garden that is the glimmer of eternal truth, promising us that we have lives that matter, and that things like courage or generosity, high things, or simple things like a good meal, a good book, a true friendship, are not just passing sensations that give us pleasure, but they are something like emanations of the eternal tuning fork. So is ultimate reality attested to by ugliness and death and pain and absence, or by the beautiful, the true, and the good? All of you will have your own answer to this. For a lot of us, it might be some kind of inarticulable mingling of the two, and that's fair enough. This is not a question that science can or ever will be able to touch. It's not one that an argument can solve. Sometimes our opinions on this question can change, but usually what changes it is going to be experience and not an argument, experience of one kind or another, and especially the experience of particular people. One of the reasons I revere Tolkien is because he is so firmly in the second camp, in the camp that believes that the truth of things is found in the beauty of the world. And the world not meaning simply the social world of human beings, and not simply meaning this little blue and green marble circling the sun, but the created world as a whole is good, that life is good, even when it seems impossible that that could be so. Tolkien is well known, among other things, for his almost overwhelming love of the natural world. It's something that attracted in the 60s, as his books were becoming famous in North America, that attracted many in the sort of broader hippie movement to him, which was not a fan base he was especially keen to exploit. He would find himself getting rung up in Oxford at 3 a.m. by someone who'd say something like, "Gandalf is really Frodo's father, man. I figured it out. Is it true?" And he didn't really want that kind of conversation. But he was attractive to that group of people partly because he has this sort of anti-industrialist reverence of nature. And fair enough. To love Tolkien is to love many things. It's to love those extraordinary action scenes, the descriptions of the brooding malevolence of Shelob, of the sort of terrible, bleak austerity of the Dark Tower, all of that, the sense of history. But one thing you have to love, and that is a deal breaker for many people, are the long, long, loving paragraphs of landscape description, which are one of the most striking characteristics of his books, and often not noticed by some readers who I think are sort of skimming through them in order to get to the next moment of action, or at least of drama. But these moments aren't just local color for Tolkien. He's telling us how we are supposed to look at the world, and you won't find many authors more gifted in describing the world, or at least certain corners of the world, mainly the world of the sort of temperate climate zone of Western Europe, which he was familiar with. But he understands how landscape is put together. He understands how climate and weather interact with landscape. He understands how certain belts of vegetation pass into one another, and how vegetation interacts with different kinds of elevation and rock and soil and things like that, and the way rivers move among hills and fields. And he wants us to understand it too. And so just at the beginning, I thought I would read a passage from The Two Towers, from one of my favorite chapters in the whole of The Lord of the Rings, chapter 4 of the second part of The Two Towers, of Herbs and Stewed Rabbits, where Frodo and Sam, on their journey to Mount Doom, are passing through a region called Ithilien. After a long and quite horrible trek through the dead marshes and the slag heaps and slurry pits surrounding the entrance to Mordor, they're going south. Gollum has convinced them not to attempt to pass the main gate of Mordor, but to go by a secret way that he knows. And so with some trepidation, they agree to this. But one of the benefits of it is that they pass through a region on the western side of one of the mountain ranges of Mordor that has been mostly at this point unstained by the enemy. And so for them, as hobbits from the beautiful world of the Shire, the sort of almost holy, pastoral, holy with an H, pastoral world of the Shire, they're now passing through a landscape that is a kind of balm through their hearts. And notice how in 2 paragraphs Tolkien takes his time. And in doing this, he is doing absolutely nothing to progress his plot. And as I say, he's probably testing the patience of readers who are eager to simply see what happens next. But I'm going to read these 2 paragraphs to you. So bear with me. I know you're all wondering about my computer. It's still on the fritz. OU is taking its time fixing it, so I'm shuffling my papers. But here's this passage from The Two Towers. Day was opening in the sky, and they saw that the mountains were now much further off, receding eastward in a long curve that was lost in the distance. Before them, as they turned west, gentle slopes ran down into dim hazes far below. All about them were small woods of resinous trees, fir and cedar and cypress, and other kinds unknown in the Shire, with wide glades among them, and everywhere there was a wealth of sweet-smelling herbs and shrubs. The long journey from Rivendell had brought them far south of their own land, but not until now in this more sheltered region had the hobbits felt the change of clime. Here spring was already busy about them. Fronds pierced moss and mold. Larches were green-fingered, small flowers were opening in the turf, birds were singing. Ithilien, the garden of Gondor, now desolate, kept still, a disheveled dryad loveliness. South and west it looked, towards the warm lower vales of Anduin, the great river, shielded from the east by Efelduath, and yet not under the mountain shadow, protected from the north by the Emyn Muil, open to the southern airs and the moist winds from the sea far away. Many great trees grew there, planted long ago, falling into untended age amid a riot of careless descendants, and groves and thickets there were, of tamarisk and pungent terebinth, of olive and of bay, and there were junipers and myrtles, and thymes that grew in bushes, or with their woody creeping stems mantled in deep tapestries the hidden stones, sages of many kinds putting forth blue flowers or red or pale green, and marjorams and new sprouting parsleys, and many herbs of forms and scents beyond the garden lore of Sam. The grots and rocky walls were already starred with saxifrages and stone crops. Primaroles and anemones were awake in the filbert brakes, and asphodel, and many lily flowers nodded their half-opened heads in the grass, deep green grass beside the pools, where falling streams halted in cool hollows on their journey down to Anduin. So that is just a little touchstone, almost, just a little example of what I think is much closer to the beating heart of Tolkien's fiction than the average reader maybe tends to appreciate. Although I'm sure it works its magic on the average reader at least as much as it does on me. But I used the word loving when I described Tolkien's passages of landscape description, and I think that adjective is borne out by what I just read. You can't look that closely at the natural world and not only see physical, chemical, biological facts about it, but beauty within it without loving it. What Tolkien does in a passage like that, and it's not the only way in which he does this thing, but what he does is affirm that the world is good and that it deserves our love. And this is more a matter of faith for him than of, absolute fact of the matter, but that it will repay our love. The world is broken. He knows that as well as anyone. And if you know about the first 20 or 25 years of his life, you know that Tolkien didn't need any lessons on the brokenness of the world. Father died when he was a very little boy. Family moves to England, and because of his mother's conversion to Roman Catholicism, they're ostracized by the wider Protestant family, so that they live in something very close to poverty until she dies, when her two boys are not even teenagers. He lives with his brother Hilary, raised by, I think it's Father Francis, a Catholic priest who looks after them, but living with this loss. And then, of course, that's all a prelude, a painful prelude, but a prelude to the great terrifying meat grinder of the Western Front, which he has to experience firsthand, which would remove anyone's illusions about the goodness of the world being a sort of simple, obvious, unquestionable truth, rather than a truth you have to fight for. But he does fight for it. So let's get down to business and look at a couple of other passages that are a little more close to the center of things. Those passages describing Ithilien, there's much one could say about them. They make me wish I knew my botany or my gardening as well as Tolkien does. Tolkien, I'll just say, he loves landscapes, he loves mountains, he loves the ocean, he loves farmland, he loves stars. The only thing he maybe loves more than stars are trees. I think nothing from the created world matters more to Tolkien than trees. And if you know his work, The Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit, certainly the Silmarillion, and even sort of more kind of offhand works like Leaf by Nigel or Smith of Wootton Major. Trees are so absolutely central and dominating an image in all his work that, the passage I read gives a little indication of that. But anyhow, I'm going to look at two other passages that touch on this thing and do so by way of another idea that came up in the passage from the Aina Lindalei, his creation myth at the beginning of the episode, of music. And so what does that have to do with the goodness of the world? Well, maybe I'll be able to bring that out. Music and the spoken word or the sung word. So our first passage is from The Fellowship of the Ring, Chapter 8, Fog on the Barrow Downs. Early in the novel, the four hobbits, Frodo, Sam, Pippin, Merry, are fleeing to Rivendell. Frodo is hoping that they can make it to this stronghold of the elves in one piece, and that when he's there, someone can advise him as to what to do with the ring and hopefully take it off of him. And the Black Riders are in pursuit. The hobbits have had only a little bit of distant contact with the Black Riders, enough to scare them. Much worse is to come. They cut through a region that the hobbits are generally afraid of, called the Old Forest. And the Old Forest, Tolkien loves forests and he loves trees, but he also understands the world of growing things as beautiful and good, but also dangerous. And forests are always in his work places of danger, because humans belong in certain corners of the world, but forests are places where we only sort of belong. And so some forests can be quite menacing in his work. In the Old Forest, they have a misadventure and get into trouble, and they are saved, most of you will know, by, although you won't know it if all you know is the movies, they're saved by the greatest enigma in all of his writing, which is a strange fellow with a blue coat and yellow boots named Tom Bombadil. Tom Bombadil is a character who fits very oddly into his story, and Tolkien was okay with that. Tom Bombadil was a character he invented in the 1930s when his children were young, based on a doll, a funny-looking doll that one of his children have, and so he would tell them stories and rhymes about this doll, Tom Bombadil. He weaves him into The Lord of the Rings, and he was very candid in letters saying that he wasn't quite sure what he was doing and that he didn't want to analyze what he was doing too closely. That there was this felt sense that Tom needed to be in this story, even though he's by no means central to the plot, and what he represents is difficult to articulate. He's a figure of power. He's good-natured. He's almost absurdly cheerful. He speaks, even when he's not singing, he speaks in metrical verse. And so everything he says is a kind of poem song. And he holds great power over the lands about him. He seems concerned with very little. His beautiful wife Goldberry, and the natural world immediately around him and its life cycle. He comes upon the hobbits and saves them when he's gathering water lilies for his wife. He's good. So when he sees they're in trouble, he helps them and he befriends them and he does what he can to take care of them for about 24 hours. But there's nothing proactive about him. Readers who try to argue that he's a sort of manifestation of God within the story, I think are way off, or even that he's sort of one of the angelic powers that for Tolkien are the lieutenants of God who sort of do the business of running the world. I think that's kind of off base. We can't know for sure what this strange figure Tom Bombadil, with his rhymes and his songs and his muddy boots, is. But for me, he seems to be a kind of distillation of reality itself, or of life itself. or of nature, something like that. So he saves the hobbits, he gives them hospitality, and he sends them on their way. And he warns them that as they set out traveling northeast, that they're going to pass through the region of the Barrow Downs. And this is a kind of menacing region that the hobbits are dimly aware of. Downs, downland in England, are sort of long series of rolling grass hills with few trees on them. Barrows come from northwestern European, Anglo-Saxon, Scandinavian culture, and they are burial mounds. And they appear at a few other places in Tolkien's work. The idea that a great lord or king would be buried, probably with a good deal of treasure and weapons and things like that, and a great pile of earth, a small hill raised over him. So the Barrow Downs are these series of hills that have these grave mounds on them. And these grave mounds are ancient, stretching back 1,000 years or more. And Tom warns the hobbits to be careful there. He says to stay on the green grass and to not venture into the stonier outcroppings where the tombs are, because they are haunted by what Tolkien refers to as barrow wights. Wight, spelled W-I-G-H-T, in Old English means just something like being or person. So you could say just the barrow ghosts or the barrow folk. So these spirits that haunt the downs. And he tells the hobbits, just be careful, try to go as northward as you can until you hit the main east road, and then you'll be okay. But he tells them, if you get into trouble and you're still in this neck of the woods, because Tom is not going to go with them and he's not going to pop up anywhere they might need him in the future, but if you're still in my neighborhood, call me. And he teaches them a song to summon him, and he says, I'll come and help you. Sure enough, the hobbits get into trouble. They're wandering among the hills, and eventually they become sort of seduced and ensnared by these homeless ghosts. And one by one they all get sucked in as night is falling. And so after this has happened, Frodo wakes up and he's in a crypt, a stone tomb. And he sees the other 3 hobbits, his friends, lying, Tolkien says, as though dead, with a long naked sword lying across their necks. So how nightmarish is that? And so Frodo, in the dimness, can see this and is terrified. And that brings us to this first of our passages. So I'll read it now. So this is the Fellowship of the Ring, chapter 8. Frodo is, it's told from Frodo's perspective. Suddenly a song began, a cold murmur, rising and falling. The voice seemed far away and immeasurably dreary, sometimes high in the air and thin, sometimes like a low moan from the ground. Out of the formless stream of sad but horrible sounds, strings of words would now and again shape themselves, grim, hard, cold words, heartless and miserable. The night was railing against the morning of which it was bereaved, and the cold was cursing the warmth for which it hungered. Frodo was chilled to the marrow. After a while the song became clearer, and with dread in his heart he perceived that it had changed into an incantation. Cold be hand and heart and bone, and cold be sleep under stone. Never more to wake on stony bed, never till the sun fails and the moon is dead. In the black wind the stars shall die, and still on gold here let them lie, till the Dark Lord lifts his hand over dead sea and withered land. He heard behind his head a creaking and scraping sound. Raising himself on one arm, he looked and saw now in the pale light that they were in a kind of passage which behind them turned a corner. Round the corner a long arm was groping, walking on its fingers towards Sam, who was lying nearest, and towards the hilt of the sword that lay upon him. At first Frodo felt as if he had indeed been turned into stone by the incantation. Then a wild thought of escape came to him. He wondered if he put on the ring whether the barrow wight would miss him and he might find some way out. He thought of himself running free over the grass, grieving for Merry and Sam and Pippin, but free and alive himself. Gandalf would admit that there had been nothing else he could do. But the courage that had been awakened in him was now too strong. He could not leave his friends so easily. He wavered, groping in his pocket, and then fought with himself again, and as he did so the arm crept nearer. Suddenly resolve hardened in him, and he seized a short sword that lay beside him, and kneeling he stooped low over the bodies of his companions. With what strength he had, he hewed at the crawling arm near the wrist, and the hand broke off, but at the same moment the sword splintered up to the hilt. There was a shriek, and the light vanished. In the dark there was a snarling noise. Frodo fell forward over Merry, and Merry's face felt cold. All at once, back into his mind from which it had disappeared with the first coming of the fog, came the memory of the house down under the hill and of Tom singing. He remembered the rhyme that Tom had taught them. In a small, desperate voice he began, "Ho, Tom Bombadil," and with that name his voice seemed to grow strong. It had a full and lively sound, and the dark chamber echoed as if to drum and trumpet. "Ho, Tom Bombadillo, by water, wood, and hill, by the reed and willow, by fire, sun, and moon, hearken now and hear us. Come, Tom Bombadil, for our need is near us." There was a sudden deep silence in which Frodo could hear his heart beating. After a long, slow moment he heard plain but far away, as if it were coming down through the ground or through thick walls, an answering voice singing, "Old Tom Bombadil is a merry fellow, bright blue his jacket is, and his boots are yellow. None has ever caught him yet, for Tom he is the master. His songs are stronger songs, and his feet are faster." There was a loud rumbling sound, as if of stones rolling and falling, and suddenly light streamed in, real light, the plain light of day. A low door-like opening appeared at the end of the chamber beyond Frodo's feet, and there was Tom's head, hat, feather, and all, framed against the light of the sun rising red behind him. The light fell upon the floor, and upon the faces of the three hobbits lying beside Frodo. They did not stir, but the sickly hue had left them. They looked now as if they were only very deeply asleep. Tom stooped, removed his hat, and came into the dark chamber singing, "Get out, you old wight, vanish in the sunlight, shrivel like the cold mist, like the winds go wailing, out into the barren lands, far beyond the mountains, come never here again, leave your barrow empty, lost and forgotten be, darker than the darkness, where gates stand forever shut, till the world is mended." At these words there was a cry, and part of the inner end of the chamber fell in with a crash. Then there was a long trailing shriek fading away into an unguessable distance, and after that silence. "Come, friend Frodo," said Tom, "let us go out onto clean grass. You must help me bear them." So, a longish passage, and I've got another one in a few minutes, but a few things. So, this is a moment of desperation, a moment Gandalf will talk about later, a highly significant moment where Frodo is tempted to put on the ring. And we will come to know that what the ring seems to promise Frodo of escape is a false promise, that it's the most dangerous thing he could do, that in putting on the ring he would be naked to the world of spirits, and the things that haunt these tombs would then really have him. So it's a moment of drama and tension, but what I want mainly to talk about is the way in which the tension is colored or is surrounding these two very contrary views of the world. So Frodo, when he comes to and takes stock of where he is, hears this song begin, a song that first does not have words that he can make out, a voice that is miserable and sad, high sometimes and moaning sometimes, and then he begins to catch fragments of sentences. Grim, hard, cold words, heartless and miserable, Tolkien says. And he goes on to say in powerful lines, the night was railing against the morning, of which it was bereaved, and the cold was cursing the warmth for which it hungered. So there's an animosity here that's being expressed on behalf of darkness and coldness and absence, a resentment towards what is, a resentment that I think Tolkien would agree, although he never liked people to push theology too hard on his work. He did say The Lord of the Rings was fundamentally a religious novel, although he said it took him a while in the 10 years of writing it before he really figured that out. But we have a kind of satanic resentment for life and for beauty, the resentment of dark against light and the resentment of cold against warmth. And so as Frodo listens to this, he is chilled and he understands that he's hearing not just a point of view, but what he calls an incantation that is clearly a curse being put over the hobbits, and that he now is the only one awake, is the only one who can stand against it, if he can. The song that the Spirit sings is a song of coldness, and it is seducing the hearer into coldness and darkness, with the premise that they are a kind of absolute that cannot be fought very long. And so they are death. Come into this sleep and never again wake on the stony bed. Never, the voice says, till the sun fails and the moon is dead. So the sun and moon themselves are finite things, and they won't last forever. And in the certitude of their finitude, if that's not a silly way to put it, is the kind of confidence behind this seduction, that one day all will be black and bleak, and so just sleep and let go. In the black wind, the voice says, the stars shall die. So lie, let them lie, your friends, in the gold, until one day the Dark Lord, and this white, this spirit is not the Dark Lord, and is not even really a servant of the Dark Lord, but is a kind of advocate on his behalf. One day the Dark Lord will claim all, and in claiming all, he will make all nothing. And so this is what Frodo is being seduced by, and it's powerful. It's the seduction of hopelessness and despair, and those are powerful things. And then, as though to drive the point home, he sees this ghastly or monstrous arm creeping out, as though it's about to take the sword and cut the throats of the three hobbits. And here he faces one of these decision points, which are so crucial to the structure of Tolkien's narratives, which from one perspective can be said to be made up of decision points amid what seems to be hopelessness. When courage can only get you into trouble because the basis for courage seems absurd, and the power of darkness and coldness and death seems unquestionable. Characters are put in these situations where they have nevertheless to act against it. I think again of this young man, 20 years old, as a second lieutenant in Flanders, who, like millions of men in his generation, would have known those moments when we simply have to fix our bayonets and do what seems not only impossible but absurdly impossible. Moments when one of us has to volunteer to be the one to creep out on our belly into no man's land with the wire cutters and try to make a hole in the barbed wire. Moments when we have to go over the top. And so Frodo's facing a moment like this, and it seems as though It's not a 50-50 proposition, but a 100-0 proposition. And the 100 is all on the wrong side. And so the first thing that occurs to him, and I won't get into this too much, if you know the books or even the movies, you have maybe a rough or maybe quite a strong, maybe a better than my sense of what's going on. But the first thing that happens quite naturally from the book's perspective is that he's seduced by the ring. The ring promises him escape, and as I say, it's a false escape. But all he wants is to be free, and part of him is willing to leave the other three behind and have to explain it to Gandalf later. What does he want? It says he wants to be free, running over the grass. The grass. And so this is the temptation to abandon them. And this in its own way would mean lying down forever on that stony bed, a giving up. He's a hobbit, though, and hobbits, as we are often told, are tougher than they look. He fights this urge, and he does what seems to be the hopelessly impossible thing. He picks up the sword and he hacks at the arm, and he hears a shriek, and the arm is cut, and it's now that he's able to remember Tom. And so Tom has given him this song to chant. I love Tolkien's poetry. There are moments, poetry is interwoven through all of his work. Some readers find it annoying and they skip past it. Some of those professional snobs I mentioned roll their eyes because Tolkien is not Keats. He's not the most gifted poet of his generation. I think he's a talented poet, although a lot of his poetry is what would technically be called light verse, sort of sing-songy, occasional, sometimes childlike, sometimes childish, sometimes funny verse. He can write more serious verse, and if it's not going to go down as some of the greatest English poetry ever written, it is capable. But the Tom Bombadil rhymes are silly. And so it is rather absurd to think of Frodo chanting this goofy song about Tom Bombadil and his yellow boots in this place. But if that's what you've got, that's what you use. And so he calls upon Tom Bombadil. He calls upon him, and in the song he invokes what? Not just Tom himself, but water, wood, and hill, reed and willow, fire, sun, and moon. Hearken now and hear us, come Tom Bombadil, for our need is near us. The Wight, you will notice, had prophesied the time when the sun would fail and the moon be dead, and the stars die. And Frodo invokes Tom in the name of those things, or invokes those things in summoning Tom. And so Tom comes, and Frodo hears his voice singing in return. And of course, Tom, for all of his earthiness, is a kind of supernatural, or that's not that Tolkien wouldn't agree with that. He's a kind of ultra-natural figure. So a figure with a kind of spiritual as well as physical power. And so he's there when they need him. And Frodo hears his voice singing this absurd rhyme about his bright blue jacket and his yellow boots. But what does he say? No, none has ever caught him yet, for Tom, he is the master. His songs are stronger songs, and his feet are faster. So the fast feet, I suppose, explains why he can be there when they need him. And the stronger songs says something about what he can do in this moment. What are those songs stronger than? Well, the song we just heard, the song of the Wight. And so Tom comes in to the crypt, and the first thing that comes in with him is the light. What does Tolkien call it? The plain light of day. You know, not a spectral light, not an eerie phosphorescent light, not the bright neon lights, not a sort of dazzling crystalline light, but the plain light of day. And I think most of us at one time or another have been, whether in childhood or in adulthood, have been in moments where the plain light of day is what we long for. In its sort of simple unassumingness, it has this extraordinary potency. And so the plain light of day is just what they long for. And that's what comes into the crypt along with Tom. Frodo can see as it falls across the faces of his friends that they don't look as pallid and sick or even dead as he had thought them. And Tom comes inside of the crypt, and he gives his stronger song. And his song is a song of exorcism and banishment, driving the white out of this place. So it's not just that the spirit will be held at bay so that the four hobbits can escape, but it is cast out. And so that this place will no longer be haunted. And notice Tom's exorcism of the white isn't exactly a kind of, vengeful destruction of it. He gives the white exactly what the white seems to already embody, which is nothingness. And so he says, shrivel like the cold mist, like the winds go wailing out into the barren lands, far beyond the mountains. So he casts the white out into the cold that the white had been an advocate of, far beyond the mountains. So he sort of casts him out of Middle-earth itself into nothingness. Come never here again, leave your barrow empty, lost and forgotten be, darker than the darkness. So that darkness that the white had proclaimed is what the white now is given, where gates stand forever shut. And then a last clause, which is the most vital and the most beautiful, till the world is mended. Within Tolkien, one of the ways to understand The Lord of the Rings is that it is a meditation upon death. The Lord of the Rings is always concerned with the human experience, although sometimes it's shared by other creatures like dwarves and hobbits, and in a sense, elves, although they're much more complicated if you know the stories, because technically they don't die. But they do die in a sense in that they change. And so The Lord of the Rings is a meditation on death and letting go. But within The Lord of the Rings is Tolkien's Christian perspective, which says that these things are not eternal absolutes, but things that will be passed through. And in various ways across his corpus, and especially in these novels, we have these quiet but insistent proclamations that the destiny of the world is that it will be mended, that the broken will be made whole, and that the bent will be straight, and that the beautiful things which we love so much, partly because they pass away from us and are only with us for a moment, are destined to be eternal things. And so Tom's song is a prophecy of the eternal, everlasting value of the good things of the world, which includes the four hobbits. And so he banishes the white with that stronger song of affirmation. And then I just love how, as the paragraph closes after his song, he doesn't just say to Frodo, what's going on here? What do you need? Let's wake these guys up and have a drink of water. He says, let's bring them out onto the clean grass, which is good in itself, and which is healing and restorative in itself, just as it's healing for Frodo and Sam 20 chapters later, to be walking through the disheveled beauty of Ithilien. And so let's bring them out into the clean grass, and recall that when Frodo was contemplating putting on the ring and escaping from the white, he imagined himself running over the grass. And that was, as I said, false, because the ring would have the opposite effect and would only pull him deeper in to the reality of the Barrow White. But the grass was what he longed for in that moment. But in Tom's handling, the grass is real, and they will be taken out there and restored. Let's look at a passage from The Return of the King that's similar but different. So in this passage, we're much, much further into the story. We're in the Tower of Cirith Ungol in the first chapter of the last book of Lord of the Rings, the second book of The Return of the King. Sam and Frodo have had a heck of a time of it. At the end of the two towers, Sam, of course, believes that Frodo is dead, that he has been killed by Shelob, the monstrous spider. He sees Frodo's body, and the body is lifeless, and he chafes Frodo's hands for a while and tries to revive him, but can't. And so he believes the only thing he can do, even though all he wants to do is lie down and die beside Frodo. He thinks the only thing he can do and the thing he must do is take the ring from Frodo and continue on the journey. He finds out shortly thereafter, as a band of orcs passes by and finds Frodo's body, that Frodo was not dead, but anesthetized by Shelob's spider venom. And so the orcs take up Frodo's body and take it into their tower, where they are going to imprison Frodo prior to transportation to the Dark Tower, where, of course, he'll be tortured into madness by Sauron, who will find out that Sam has the ring, because Frodo, like anyone else, can't withstand that interrogation for very long. So Sam is wearing the ring, and that means he's able to be invisible and to sneak into the tower in pursuit of the orcs and in order to find Frodo. But he can't find Frodo after much searching in the tower. He's looked and he's looked and he's looked, and he doesn't know what's happened. Have they spirited him away somewhere? Where is Frodo? We pick up in Sam's moment of despair. So this is Return of the King, second book, chapter 1. He ran back to the lower story and tried the door. It would not move. He ran up again, and sweat began to trickle down his face. He felt that even minutes were precious, but one by one they escaped, and he could do nothing. He no longer cared for Shagrat or Snagga or any other orc that was ever spawned. He longed only for his master, for one sight of his face or one touch of his hand. At last, weary, and feeling finally defeated, he sat on a step below the level of the passage floor and bowed his head into his hands. It was horribly quiet. The torch, that was already burning low when he arrived, sputtered and went out, and he felt the darkness cover him like a tide. And then softly, to his own surprise, there at the vain end of his long journey and his grief, moved by what thought in his heart he could not tell, Sam began to sing. His voice sounded thin and quivering in the cold dark tower, the voice of a forlorn and weary hobbit that no listening orc could possibly mistake for the clear song of an elven lord. He murmured old childish tunes out of the Shire, and snatches of Mr. Bilbo's rhymes that came into his mind like fleeting glimpses of the country of his home. And then suddenly new strength rose in him, and his voice rang out, while words of his own came unbidden to fit the simple tune. In western lands beneath the sun, the flowers may rise in spring, the trees may bud, the waters run, the merry finches sing. Or there may be 'tis cloudless night, and swaying beaches bear the elven stars as jewels white amid their branching hair. Though here at journey's end I lie in darkness buried deep, beyond all towers strong and high, beyond all mountains steep, above all shadows rides the sun, and stars forever dwell. I will not say the day is done, nor bid the stars farewell. Beyond all towers strong and high, he began again, and then he stopped short. He thought that he had heard a faint voice answering him, but now he could hear nothing. Yes, he could hear something, but not a voice. Footsteps were approaching. Now a door was being opened quietly in the passage above. The hinges creaked. Sam crouched down, listening. The door closed with a dull thud, and then a snarling orc voice rang out. "Hola, you up there, you dunghill rat, stop your squeaking or I'll come and deal with you, J.R.R." There was no answer. "All right," growled Snagga, "but I'll come and have a look at you all the same and see what you're up to." The hinges creaked again, and Sam, now peering over the corner of the passage threshold, saw a flicker of light in an open doorway and the dim shape of an orc coming out. He seemed to be carrying a ladder. Suddenly the answer dawned on Sam. The topmost chamber was reached by a trap door in the roof of the passage. Snagga thrust the ladder upwards, steadied it, and then clambered out of sight. Sam heard a bolt drawn back. Then he heard the hideous voice speaking again. "You lie quiet or you'll pay for it. You've not got long to live in peace, I guess, but if you don't want the fun to begin right now, you keep your trap shut, see? There's a reminder for you." There was the sound like the crack of a whip. At that, rage blazed in Sam's heart to sudden fury. He sprang up, ran, and went up the ladder like a cat. His head came out in the middle of the floor of a large round chamber. A red lamp hung from its roof. The westward window slit was high and dark. Something was lying on the floor by the wall under the window, but over it a black orc shape was straddled. It raised the whip a second time, but the blow never fell. With a cry, Sam leapt across the floor, sting in hand. The orc wheeled round, but before it could make a move, Sam slashed its whip hand from its arm. Howling with pain and fear, but desperate, the orc charged head down at him. Sam's next blow went wide, and thrown off his balance, he fell backward, clutching at the orc as it stumbled over him. Before he could scramble up, he heard a cry and a thud. The orc in its wild haste had tripped on the ladder head and fallen through the open trapdoor. Sam gave no more thought to it. He ran to the figure huddled on the floor. It was Frodo. Okay, so a little more pulse pounding than the last passage. Like the last passage, it's literally and figuratively dark at its opening. Both these passages begin in a moment of sort of emotional, spiritual, as well as physical bleakness. And so Sam is bereft and out of hope, tormented by the knowledge that Frodo is somewhere near, hopefully still alive, but he cannot find him. And so as the passage, where I started the passage, Sam is engulfed. And so Tolkien illustrates this partly because the torch goes out. And I always wonder when I see, medieval or fantasy television, Game of Thrones or something like that, or movies, people just light torches as though they're flashlights with no sense that, first of all, they're kind of dangerous, and second of all, they're finite and they'll only burn for a while. And this torch gutters and goes out. And so Sam is left in the darkness. And that is, of course, key to his emotional state, because he is hopeless. And so Tolkien says he felt the darkness cover him like a tide. So his situation is roughly comparable, maybe not that roughly, to Frodo's in the Barrow. Now it's going to be up to Sam to save Frodo. But now Tom Bombadil isn't 2 streets over, able to come and help. Sam is going to have to do this himself, which is to say he's going to have to make his own song. I've said a few things about the singing. First of all, Sam's poetry is not complex at all. It's rough and ready, but it gets the job done. And it gets the job done by expressing veneration for the goodness of things and for the eternal principles which stand behind them. Tolkien, of course, was a professional philologist, a scholar who studied language. Language was his first love, and language was the thing that first fascinated him with the idea of building the hypothetical world that the ancient, long-vanished cultures, including the Anglo-Saxons of northwestern Europe, might have lived in. So much of their mythology had been lost, in contrast to that of the Greeks and Romans, And so Tolkien, from an early age, wondered what it might have been like. And his own legendarium and the novels that came out of it was in part an attempt to make a possible or a plausible substitute for that lost mythology. But language was what brought him into that, and so language matters to him. And for a person like Tolkien, with his convictions, and those are not only professional but religious, words are things, and they are things of power. And they are not just like I remember years since I've seen it, but there's an episode in the TV show Succession, which some of you may know, where one of the characters, who's a bit of a flim-flam artist, is trying to convince some others of the sort of reconciliation around a business deal, and he's trying to explain away a problem, and he talks about how we did say that we were going to do this one thing, but it was just words. And he says something like, forgive me, I can't remember the exact line, but he says something like, it's just words, it's complicated breathing, which is great. That was a great line to illustrate the perspective of that character. And that's a seductive way of thinking. It's certainly the way of thinking which has characterized much of at least the predominant sort of scholarly perspective for much of the 20th and 21st century, that words are just complicated language, that there's a fundamental arbitrariness behind them all. And they're just a matter of games, of gameplay, of manipulation, but they don't bespeak truth in any more, at least, than a kind of accidental way. But Tolkien doesn't believe that. Words are powerful. What in our lives is more powerful than words, really, if you think about it? Not just because judges can issue orders or presidents or whomever can issue orders and have things done, but think about the power of words in your own life, the power of someone else's word to either lift you up or crush you emotionally, to make or mar your day. Words have power. And so Sam's singing is not just a way of sort of stirring himself up emotionally or consoling himself. It is as though a piece of copper filament has been laid between his heart now through those words and the eternal, and the current can flow through those words into him and beyond. And so he's sitting there in the darkness, but he begins to sing, and he doesn't sing in Elvish the way Frodo does at other times. He doesn't invoke the Valar. He doesn't sing of Beren and Luthien or the other great figures of Tolkien's lore. He sings songs of childhood and of the Shire and things written by Bilbo, and what Tolkien calls fleeting glimpses of that they fill his mind like fleeting glimpses of the country of his home. So these words are a point of connection in part to the Shire and to his past. And the point is not just that that's consolatory, but it is good with a capital G. The place he comes from is good. And the life he had there was good. And the play that they had there and the sweetness and these things were good, and there is power in that goodness. And then he finds what Tolkien calls words of his own, and so he sings his own little song. He sings about Western lands. He's right now in Eastern lands, and it's not that Eastern lands aren't good, but for the horror of Mordor, which is broken out in a part of them. We've seen some Eastern lands already in the last hour, and they are good too. But he's thinking of the Western lands, which are, maybe he's thinking of his own home in the Shire. Maybe he's thinking of the undying home of the elves in the ultimate West. But in his song, he proclaims that whatever is going on here and now, and however black and terrible the situation is, there is still a sun shining on land somewhere There are still flowers that can bloom again in the spring, and trees that can bud, and waters that can run. And then he gives us this gorgeous image of a starry night where the stars seem to be as jewels in the trees, like jewels woven into the hair of elves. And so he says, as the song continues, though here I lie in darkness buried deep, and again remember the barrow and the barrow white, beyond this tower, strong and high as it is, beyond these steep mountains, the sun is up there and the stars are up there. Remember again, the barrow white had prophesied the ultimate death of sun and moon and stars, but Sam is saying, no, they dwell there forever. And so he says, I'm not going to say goodbye to them. Sam's words are not sort of meant by him to have incantatory power the way Tom's quite clearly do, but nonetheless they are an incantation. And Tolkien signals this by the fact that when Sam sings, something happens. Sam doesn't exactly intend this. He's in a moment of desperation and he starts singing out merely, I guess, to buoy himself up in his desperation or to kind of defy the night. And yet when he does so, something happens. It's very plain and ordinary. It's not like lightning bolts break through the top of the tower or angels come down. All that happens is that one of the few orcs who's left alive in the tower, Snagga, thinks something's going on and it must be our captive singing that song, so I'm going to go sort him out. That's all it is. It's nothing very grand, but it's enough. When Sam sings, something happens, and all of a sudden the key to the situation is there, because Snagga goes in, threatening Frodo because he thinks Frodo's the one who's been singing, and cracks his whip at him, and that allows Sam to discover where Frodo is and to find him. I'm not sure. It may be that Frodo himself has replied, though Sam couldn't hear it, and that alerted Snagga, or it might be that Snagga is alerted by Sam's voice singing. But when Sam sings, that song has effect. A door is quite literally opened, and Sam can find Frodo again, just as Tom Bombadil could find the hobbits. So we've got the plaiting together here of several threads that have to do with song as a kind of, I said to Eric, I'm not going to get into Tolkien's whole artistic theory of subcreation because that will be too much of a rabbit hole right now in what's already a long episode. But the words we have are our own. They are one of the ways in which we can participate in creation by creating ourselves under God, taking the world that he made and yet embroidering it with the gift of language. And so Frodo, Tom, and Sam all, in various ways, or maybe in the same way ultimately, are able to sort of voice the music of goodness itself in these dark moments. Tolkien's work is filled with a kind of faith that is, I think, quite steely and sturdy and strong, but also woven in so delicately into these stories. And it's never, I think it's something he lets slip sometimes in the details. But for him, the natural world is not just a kind of therapeutic, the way it's sometimes sold to us, In Tolkien's generation, not too many people were great advocates of nature, either in environmentalist terms or in the terms of kind of, ecotourism or anything like that. Tolkien was a kind of anti-industrialist, lover of the natural world from a very early age. And of course, everything he saw in the First World War, which he mirrored in the slag heaps and ash heaps of Mordor, only reinforced that. But nowadays, it's sometimes suggested that the natural world is a kind of soothing thing for us. And if we get out in nature, it makes us feel better. And, that's true. Get out there on the clean grass. There is a healing potency in it. But Tolkien wants to go further. There's a healing potency in it because it is good. Even though there are mosquitoes and black flies and piranhas and whatever else it is that worries us in the great outdoors, there is goodness there, and it's real. And so because it's real, the songs that Tom and Sam and Frodo sing about it are real. And if it's real, that means it's precious, and so beloved as all real things are, and imbued with the power of the real itself, the real with a capital R, for healing and ultimate renewal until the world is mended. I started the episode with, if you know the Silmarillion, and teenage readers like my earlier self are always confused by this. It's Tolkien's Legendarium, his catalogs of myths and legends of the first age of Middle-earth, so thousands of years prior to the events of The Lord of the Rings. It begins with a kind of Genesis-like creation myth. And the creation myth for Tolkien, in that myth, song is the way in which the world is made. The God of the Hebrews, of course, speaks the world into creation. But the monotheistic God of the Silmarillion, and for Tolkien it's the same God as the Judeo-Christian God, it's just the way he's understood by the elves, he sings the world into creation. And not just that, but he makes songs for his angelic powers called the Ainur to sing for his delight. And so he, Iluvatar, Eru Iluvatar, the All-Father, at the beginning makes a great music, and his heavenly choir are taught the music and invited to participate in it, and even encouraged to sort of experiment within it. They sing the music and they discover ever more complexity within the music, yet still within the great themes that Iluvatar propounds. Melkor, this Luciferian figure, tries to dominate the music. It's not that he doesn't want to sing, but it's that he wants to sort of possess the song. And Tolkien describes Melkor being always foiled by Iluvatar, not because Iluvatar blasts Melkor with a kind of heavenly shotgun or anything like that, but because every time Melkor tries to dominate the music and make discordancies within it, Iluvatar, the god figure, takes those discordancies and further complexifies, if I may, the music to incorporate the discordancies and make the music richer and more beautiful. Iluvatar then shows his angelic host the sort of visible manifestation of the song they have been singing. And that visible manifestation is our world, because of course, the world that Tolkien creates, his Middle-earth, is meant to be our world at a much earlier stage of its development. But he shows them the sort of realized picture of what they've been singing. And then he invites them to enter this world that they've been singing into existence, and to be its governing powers who will rule it under his auspices. Melkor is one of those who agrees to enter the world where he will be the Lucifer figure, the tyrant who attempts to domineer over it, the first Dark Lord, who's later succeeded by Sauron, who tries to break it if he can't rule it. Others among the Ainur will not follow Melkor, but will be the good protective spirits who attempt to nurture the world and heal it of the hurts that Melkor makes. And this brings us to the passage I began with, where we have the description of several of these Ainur, these angelic figures who will enter the world, Manwe and Ulmo and Auli, who are three of the principal gods with a lowercase g, angelic deputies, who preside over the regions of the air, Manwe, the water, Ulmo, and the earth, Aule. Ulmo is who was the focus of the passage I read. And in that passage, he is given a vision of the world. This is before he steps into it. But water is to be his province. And water, of course, is inherently musical, as Tolkien always reminds us, whether it's the sound of the surf breaking on the beaches, or the sound of a river gurgling, or the sound of the rain falling. Water is musical, and so Ulmo is the most musical of the deities. And he's given a vision of how Melkor, in his satanic attempt to rule or destroy this new world, will disrupt his province of water. But Iluvatar, the god figure, shows Ulmo how every way in which Melkor tries to do that will be foiled. Not just again because Melkor will be erased and the undo key will be pressed on the keyboard, but that in all of Melkor's attempts to turn the world to evil and water to evil, more goodness and beauty will eventually come from it. And so Melkor, in entering the world, deranges the climate so that there is areas and times of great cold and then of great heat. And so this, of course, is a reality of our world, which you could say makes it more difficult for us to inhabit. You know, it wouldn't be terrible maybe if the whole planet was always sort of like Oahu or San Francisco or something like that, 75 degrees and comfortable. But Melkor deranges the climate. But Iluvatar says to Ulmo, look what this does. Look at how beautiful the frost is and the snow is. The heats that Melkor has made have raised precipitation and put water vapor in the air, but now we have the beauty of the rain. So everything he has done is being turned to the good and to what is joyful. It only increases the beauty of the world that evil has been active within it. And so it's not just that evil will ultimately be defeated, but that evil always defeats itself. Because for Tolkien, only greater goodness and greater beauty can result from any single action that a creature takes, whether the intent is good or ill. And so when Sam and Frodo are finding their courage in the darkness, ultimately the source of their courage goes back to this principle. And so, for all the death and anguish and pain that they experience, and that finite creatures experience, there is a statement here of trust that the real can be counted upon because it is anchored in ultimate goodness. Thank you very much for listening. This is David Anderson. Once again, we're glad you've joined us. And on behalf of Eric Williams, I'll say goodbye for now.